Today, we will actually talk about XLM and come around again to XDC. And that is primarily related to the current geopolitical situation around oil. And of course, because
we basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what they're doing. Do you understand that?
And yes, I actually understand that. And I will explain a lot of the opinions I have around that here. So, a lot of the posts in probably about the last week or so have been talking about a World War III Black Swan kind of an event. And I just do not agree with that. So, I am not holding it personally against anyone who has actually posted on this, because I think a lot of the specifics, especially related to the macro, geopolitical, economical kind of approach, line up with where we are at right now. I just think that the thought process behind it might not exactly be reflective of what is actually happening now. So I am particularly sensitive to what happens related to oil, because I spent about 10 years or so in the oil and gas and energy industry as an engineer. I worked in two extremely large refineries. I worked upstream oil and gas, and I worked in renewable hydrogen for a international engineering firm. So I'm not a complete novice, but I'm not an expert at the same time. However, that's really not important here, because I'm talking about crypto, as that is the main vehicle I am concentrating on at the moment that has the most return on investment opportunity. And I think a lot of the people who are actually paying attention to the content I put out are probably in the same boat. So, in my humble opinion, we are in a point in time where there are a lot of different things happening, and there are a lot of different things that we are easily able to hone in on. But in order to make the choices that are actually able to help us, we have to be able to pay attention to what is truly happening. And that is that the macro, geopolitical, and economic trend is actually in the positive. We are headed to the right and up. In terms of crypto, we're in an environment where we don't really have a lot of confidence. The engagement on YouTube and on X is absolutely horrible, which is pretty clear, as we are almost at the same point as we were in January of 2021, when things were just really beginning to pop off. And we have held that same relative area, but we are at that same point since about, I don't know, mid 2022, and there has been so much happening in the space where it's just unintelligent. I do want to address a few things, and I do want to stress that I'm not harping on any of the people who are actually posting these. I am just expressing my own individual opinion here. But I do want to play the clip here, because it does express a little bit of the geopolitical macro and the quote unquote conspiratorial kind of XRP army end of things that I do want to address as well.
2,500?
It could be. By the end of the year.
Like guaranteed in your mind, like if it ain't done by 2 years, it doesn't matter.
There's the reverse carry trade. Like these things that I've mentioned, these are catalysts that have to transpire. Like those things,
How are they coming?
they are on the doorstep.
Are they inevitable?
They're inevitable.
So when that happens, XRP, I start to see it rise. My account's going, should I liquidate? Will it come back down once it's all stabilized, or will it remain that high and higher?
It'll remain that high and higher. And the reason for that is there'll be enough liquidity in it, like we talked about before, for these counterparties that settle transactions to do that all day long. But
okay, so we are at a point in time where we have seen multiple things happen. So the price of gold has gone absolutely parabolic. Global liquidity has also begun to tick up, and on top of that, in a couple of examples, it has begun to go parabolic as well. We have seen the price of Bitcoin hold above $100,000 for quite a while now, except a couple of hiccups here and there. and the strength of the dollar is on the decline. I think at the time of this, it's around 98. The US Federal Reserve is also expected to cut rates beginning in July, September, and with the current political pressure here, I think that might happen sooner than later. However, in terms of crypto, if it happens in September instead of July, then it would probably actually help us. And we are generally in a global macroeconomic, global liquidity kind of an uptrend. And to be more specific, I do want to talk about the tokenization of oil and gas here, because that is really what has captured a lot of headlines over the last week or two. And I have actually talked about this a number of times, and I don't think I captured it all here. However, I do try to incorporate it as often as I can because I actually have experience in it. I spent about 10 years as an engineer in the oil and gas and energy industries, and while I am not an expert on the planning and economic end of things, I am a multi-discipline technical engineering expert, and I don't really like to pronounce that, but every now and then I have to. So I have talked about the tokenization of oil and gas as it relates to XRP, XLM, XDC, and on top of it all, even Velo, because of my continuous speculation that they are somehow involved in the financial infrastructure that is the underpinning of Project Enbridge. And I really think that the most clear-cut example probably actually tied into Stellar. And I don't really mean to harp on that because a lot of people actually refer to me and the content that I make as if I am a Stellar maxi. And in my own humble opinion, I am not. I just talk about what makes sense at the time I actually find it. However, it is particularly interesting that the Velo official Telegram actually chose to spread the video I made in April of 2024, which is about that's about 14 months ago at this point, involving my own speculation around how Velo, Stellar, and Ripple are not only tied together, but they also have a lot of ties into the previous Project Enbridge that has extremely heavy ties into the prominent countries and BRICS. I actually expanded upon this about a month ago, where I actually got a little bit more into the technological aspect of things, although I'm not an expert on that. As we go back to the XRP army end of things, I'm not trying to hate, but a lot of the news and a lot of the tweets are just not true. And a couple of weeks ago, it had a lot of tweets and a lot of attention around Saudi Arabia tokenizing oil and gas on the XRPL. And that just didn't really prove out to be true. However, I'm not saying that the institutional and the enterprise connections are not actually there. I am only saying that that one particular case doesn't really seem to have a lot of legs. Now I want to kind of pretend as if I'm a quantitative financial type or as if I am a geopolitical economist, because I am not. About a week ago now, we had the whole conflict in between the US and Iran and Israel. And I think I actually got in trouble here on X because I actually posted about it, which was a meme and it was hilarious and it was probably actually right. And I got shadow banned for a little bit until I actually posted about it. And then everything just kind of happened to come back online. So anyway, I am controversial, but I don't care. So here is a really interesting thing that I have been paying attention to. If you don't follow Marty Party, I would highly suggest to. He is a Solana maximalist. However, he posts tons and tons of great stuff. So on June 21st, we didn't have any air traffic at all crossing over Iraq and Iran. On June 22nd, we begun to have a little bit more commercial traffic in the country of Iran, which was where all of the conflict was. On June 24th, we began to have more air traffic over Iraq. And on June 25th, the typical commercial corridors are pretty much completely established. However, they are still bypassing Iran, which shouldn't really not be expected at this point, just with the tension and the publicly visible tension. But I would be hesitant on personally buying into that a whole lot, because I really do think there's a lot of politics that happens with the elites. And I don't think what we see is actually truth. I think we see what we are largely told to see. So I would just caution to take everything that you see with a very large grain of salt. So, on a related note, we get into the Strait of Hormuz, and that is one of the major trade routes, especially as it relates to the trade of oil and gas. And on June 22nd, we saw a Chinese oil tanker actually turn around as the tensions were escalating. And here is the Strait of Hormuz. It's not a, how do I say this? It's not a macro geopolitically friendly part of Earth. And there are a lot of reasons behind that. And in my tweet that I actually got in trouble for, I actually exposed a little bit of that, because I am actually old enough to remember when we invaded Iraq, because we were told they had WMDs, which I won't actually say what that means right now. And it turns out that they did not, and it was probably an oil grab, and it was probably an opium heist as well, which I have personal secondhand stories around that, which might seem a little ironic, but I personally value those connections and I don't have a reason not to trust them. But that is a topic for a time where I probably won't share it on this platform. So the Strait of Hormuz is important because that is the key in between the Mediterranean Ocean and the larger Southeastern Asian economies. And a lot of people were really hyping up the fear, uncertainty, and doubt around the price of oil. And that just didn't really play out. Now, it kind of did, and it spiked, but it's gone back to how it was, and it's on a downtrend when we zoom out and actually look at it in terms of the past 12 months. So West Texas Intermediate crude is kind of the US standard for what the price of crude oil is. And that's mainly just because it's the part of the country that produces a lot. If we look at Brent, it is the UK standard essentially. And that has just not found any support at all. It doesn't have a trend. It is just establishing a new low. And I want to talk about that specifically because I do have experience in the refining and the oil and gas processing and production end of things. And if you're not interested in this part here, it's okay to skip. But I have a lot of experience in the oil and gas industry in a couple of key parts of the country, particularly in the refining end of things, which controls a lot of the prices that we encounter at the gas pump. I spent about 5 years here at a refinery that was processing about 80% Eagle herd oil. And that is primarily out of this general kind of an area where it is a very light, sweet kind of a crude oil, which means that it is not as heavy and it doesn't have the amount of hydrogen sulfide as it does in other parts of the world. The other refinery that company owned was actually up around here. And that part was actually mostly Canadian tar sand stuff. And it was extremely heavy and it was extremely sour. And a lot of that stuff comes from the parts of Canada where no one actually wants to inhabit. Now, I talk about that because that is heavily influential on why the US is largely resilient to the geopolitical impact of oil and gas related trends at this point in time. If Iran shut down the Strait of Hormuz, which they were actually talking about, it would actually hurt them more than it would hurt everyone else in the short and midterm. Possibly in the long term, it would begin to actually add up, but it's just not really a plausible situation at this point in time. So, yes, 20% of the world's oil is transported in the Strait of Hormuz. However, I think I saw that about 90% of Iran's economy is actually tied into the price of oil. So it would hurt them much more disproportionately than it would hurt pretty much everyone else to shut down that trade route for an extended amount of time. I talk about the trade of oil for a very specific point, and it relates into the macroeconomic end of things and the crypto end of things entirely, because one of the things, especially with the XRP hype, is that we hear about the Japanese carry trade a lot. And in the clip I had at the start, he actually referred to that as well. So, how is the Japanese carry trade dependent on the price of oil? So, that is because Japan imports practically all of its oil. So, it is very sensitive to the geopolitical impact of things. And if we are in an environment where the price of oil is increasing, then the central bank might begin to become a lot more strict on its monetary policy, because the price of oil pretty much impacts everything. And I did not harp on it a lot, and I probably won't harp on that more here. However, the price of oil and essentially the price of energy, it pretty much impacts everything. And the global risk appetite and the energy cost are kind of obvious, and I won't get into it a whole lot, but in general, higher oil prices typically strengthen carry trade incentives because they take away from the strength of the Japanese yen. However, they are also able to rein them in and tighten them if the global risk off macroeconomic environment is in the forefront. I'm not going to try to play as if I'm an economist anymore. I will talk about some oil and gas specific things here. I worked in the Texas Gulf Coast refining industry for probably about 7 or 8 years or so. And I worked for a predominantly Texas oil refiner that was able to push about 300,000 barrels a day out of that site. And then I worked for the second largest refiner on earth, which was a very opposite kind of experience where they didn't really rely on the Texas oil and gas. They actually combined the crude oil from pretty much anywhere they were able to acquire it from on earth. And it was a very polar opposite experience. However, if we're really talking about US production of oil and gas, a lot of it is actually coming out of Texas. And I come here again because the really significant producers of oil and gas in the country here is the Permian and the Delaware, which are where most of our oil and gas production comes from right now. However, up in North Dakota, you have the Bakken, which is a light, pretty sour kind of an oil and gas compared to the relatively moderate composition here. In the Eagleford, which is mostly in between like South Texas up through San Antonio and Austin, that was a very light, sweet kind of a crude oil and gas. And then as you get into East Texas and Louisiana, it doesn't really have a lot of new activity here. However, it has a lot of old things that are being repurposed to produce a higher amount, and it has a lot of natural gas production happening around there. Now, the real key in the natural gas end of things is actually in the Pennsylvania, West Virginia, like southeastern Ohio, northwestern Virginia part of the world. And that is tons and tons of natural gas production. So under the previous US administration, we weren't really allowed to produce liquefied natural gas to provide to other countries. Under Trump, I don't know if he's actually canceled that yet or if he's implemented anything else specifically, but that is largely expected to change course and to change into a regulatory environment that is much more friendly to the US oil and gas production environment. So, to tie in some crypto with the oil and gas industry, I want to come back to XDC and a specific project and a specific company called Circularity Finance. Now, I have spoken about them probably 2 or 3 times now. The tokenomics on its own are actually pretty attractive. However, I have been in touch with their team and I continue to keep in touch as well. And they are really working on some huge things that relate to tokenizing the US oil and gas industry. And it involves institutions, it involves a bunch of governments, the Texas oil and gas industry. The Latin America oil and gas industry is actually huge. The Venezuelan and the Mexican oil and gas economies are surprisingly huge. And they are talking about tokenizing oil, and it probably isn't going to stop there. And it's really because it is a really unique opportunity that a lot of people in crypto do not have a lot of specific experience in. It's also because it's such a critical part in our everyday existence. The energy industry is not just oil and gas. The cost of energy impacts pretty much everything. It has direct impact on the price of transportation, on the agriculture and food, on the price of plastics, pretty much on the price of everything. And it is an industry that permeates everything else. And the people who are actually creating these crypto, blockchain, tokenized economies around oil and gas at the moment are really the ones to pay attention to. And I haven't talked about XDC in a while. However, there's not really a reason for that. I actually have some content that I want to talk about that once again ties in XLM and XDC, but these are ones that have existed for quite a while now and have hung around. They have hung around because of a reason, and it's not just because it's a popular thing. It's because not only have they made the corrections in terms of the technological end of things, but they have the human connection part of the deal as well.